Okay, then. There we go. Hello. Play music. How do I turn this down so I can hear myself read? Okay, we're back. We're back with more of spooky reading. We're back with more spooky reading. Alright. On the last stream, we read chapters 1, 2, and 3. Now we're gonna... Okay. Now we're gonna read chapters 4, 5, and 6. My only regret is that I don't have a bookmark for this. Okay. And I took the liberty of including my chat on screen so I don't have to look at my phone anymore. Okay, then. If you're ready... Wait. It doesn't show the concurrent viewers on my side. Okay. There we go. Hello. Hello, Rama. Alright, let's see. Okay, forget introductions. Let's get right to it. Hold on. Chapter 4. Charlie and John were... Okay, I just remembered. They're going back to the place. Charlie and John were the last ones to the mall. When they pulled up, the others were gathered tight in a circle in front of Marla's car, as if sharing a conspiracy. Come on, Marla said, before they had walked all the way to the group. She was bouncing on the balls of her feet, as if she were ready to run for the door of the abandoned building. The balls on her feet? What? Like, what, she's wearing Heelys or something? Everyone but Charlie and John had changed their clothing, wearing jeans and t-shirts, things more suited for exploration, and she had a brief moment of feeling out of place. At least I didn't wear a dress, Charlie thought. Let's go, she said. Marla's impatience seemed to be contagious, or maybe it just gave Charlie an excuse to let her real feelings come to service. She wanted to show Freddy's off to the others. Hold up, John said. He looked at Jessica. Did you explain everything? I told him about the night guard, she said. What else is in there? He looked thoughtful for a moment. I guess nothing, he said. I brought more lights. Carlton said and held up 3 flashlights of varying sizes. He tossed one to Jason, a small one with an elastic headband attached. Jason turned it on, fixed it around his head, and began moving enthusiastically in waves and circles, making the light bob and dance. I think he's wearing a headlight. Shh, Charlie said, even though he was not making any sound. Jason, Marla whispered, turn it off. We can't attract attention, remember? Jason gleefully ignored them, spinning off into the parking lot like a top. Oh wait, Jason's the kid. Crap. I told him if he's not good, he has to wait in the car. Marla told Charlie quietly. But now that we're here, I'm not sure which place is creepier. She eyed the bare branches overhead, raging in the wind, threatening to reach down and grab him. Or we can feed him to Foxy, Charlie winked. She went to her trunk and hefted out the police flashlight, but she did not turn it on. Instead, Carlton switched on 2 of his smaller lights and handed one to Jessica. They headed into the mall, knowing where they were going and what was waiting for them there. Charlie, John, Jessica, and Carlton moved through the empty spaces with a sense of purpose, but the others kept stopping to look around. Come on, Jessica said impatiently as Lamar gazed up at the atrium dome. You can see the moon, he said and pointed. Next to him, Marla nodded, mimicking his posture. It's beautiful, she said, although she could not see it. From a distance, they heard footsteps echo in the emptiness. Hey, over here, John hissed, and they hurried as quietly as they could. They could not run for fear of making noise, And so they walked fast but careful, hugging the walls. They entered the black void of the department store, creeping along in the shadows until they reached the break in the wall. John held back the hanging plastic obscuring the opening as the others maneuvered around the scaffolding. Jason was slow, and Charlie put a hand on his shoulder to hurry him up, and she steered him to the opening. A strong beam of light swept into the room, scanning up and down the walls. They all ducked through the plastic and ran down the alley to where the others were crouched down against the wall. "He saw us," Jason whispered, alarmed, running straight to his sister. "Shh," Marla said. Sorry. They waited. Charlie was next to John this time, and after that moment by the tree, whatever it was, she was almost uncomfortably aware of him. They were not quite touching, but she seemed to know exactly where he was. An awkward sixth sense. She glanced at him, but his eyes were fixed up on the opening to the hallway. Nice. They could hear the guard's footsteps now, clear in the empty space, each one distinct. He was moving slowly, deliberately. Charlie closed her eyes, listening. She could tell where he was from the sound, she thought, getting closer, then farther, crisscrossing the open room like he was hunting for something. The steps came right up to the entrance of the alley and stopped. They all held their breaths. He knows, Charlie thought, but the steps started again, and she opened her eyes and saw the light receding. He was going away. They waited, still motionless, until they could no longer hear the tapping of the hard-soled shoes. She and John both stumbled a little as they stood, and she realized that they had been leaning against each other without realizing it. She didn't look at him. Instead, she set to work taking the heaviest things off the wooden shelf. "Will I be needing this?" Lamar asked, as Charlie handed him a bucket with a saw sticking out of it. "We have to move the shelf," Jessica said. "Come on." Jessica, Charlie, Carlton, and John got back into place and moved the shelf. Lamar tried to find a place to help, but there was not really room. Marla just waited. "I'm better suited to supervising," she said when Charlie mock glared at her. This time, the screaming of the metal door was not as loud, as if it no longer protested their entrance quite so strongly. Still, Marla and Jason covered their ears. "You think that's not going to bring the guard?" Marla hissed. Charlie shrugged. Didn't last time," she said. "I know he saw us," Jason said again. The others ignored him. "His flashlight went over me, he insisted. "It's really okay, Jason," Jessica said. "We thought he saw us last night too, but it was fine." Jason looked dubious, and Lamar bent over to his eye level. "Hey, Jason," he said. "What do you think the guard would do if he saw us?" "Shoot us?" Jason whimpered, eyeing Lamar warily. "Worse," Lamar said gravely. "Community service." Jason wasn't sure what it meant, but he held his eyes open wide as though it was something terrible. "Will you leave him alone?" Marla whispered, amused. "He didn't see us," Jason reassured himself, though clearly unconvinced. Charlie turned on the big light and shone it down the hallway. "Oh my," Marla gasped. As the first light streaked across the interior of the pizzeria, suddenly it became real, and her face flustered with awe and fear. They went in one by one. The temperature seemed to drop as soon as they walked into the hall, and Charlie shivered, but she did not feel ill at ease. She knew where they were now, and she knew what they would find. When they got into the dining room, Carlton spread his arms wide and twirled. "Welcome to Freddy Fazbear's Pizza," he said in a booming announcer's voice. Jessica giggled, but the melodrama did not actually seem out of place. Marla and Lamar gaped at the room, awestruck. Charlie set the large flashlight on the ground, the beam facing up, and it lit up the main room in a dim, ghostly illumination. "Cool," Jason said. His eyes fell on the merry-go-round, and he raced for it and jumped onto the back of a pony before anyone could stop him. He was too big for it, his sneakers dangling all the way to the ground. Charlie smiled. How do I make it go? He shouted. Sorry, buddy, John said. Jason climbed off, disappointed. The arcade is over this way, Cawthon said, motioning to anyone who might follow. Marla went with him, while Jason fiddled hopefully with the carousel's control box. Oh no. Lamar had walked to the stage and was standing transfixed, starting up the animals. Charlie went over to him. I can't believe they're still here, he said as she walked up. Yeah, she said. I'd forgotten this was a real place, Lamar smiled, for the first time resembling the little boy Charlie had once known. Charlie smiled back. There was something surreal about the place. She had certainly never told any of her school friends about it. She would not have known where to begin. Worse, she would not have known where to stop. Jessica poked her head out from the retracted curtain at the side of the main stage, and they both startled. What are you doing? Lamar asked. Exploring, she said. There's nothing back here but a bunch of wires, though. She disappeared into the folds of the cloth again. After a moment, they heard a thud as she jumped to the ground, and she came strolling over. Do they work? Lamar asked, pointing at the animals. I don't know, Charlie said. Truthfully, she had no idea how they worked. They had always just been set to intermittent life by whatever alchemy her father performed in his workshop. It doesn't look like anything is missing. They should work. She reluctantly added, though in her head she questioned the idea of trying to turn them on. Hey, Jessica exclaimed. She was kneeling by the stairs to the stage. Everybody, come here now. Charlie went over and Lamar followed. What is it? Charlie asked. Oh, sorry. I think my jaw's getting tired already. Look, Jessica said, shining her little light. Though well hidden along the grain of the wood there was a door inset to the wall of the stage. How did we not see that? Charlie wondered. We weren't looking, John said, staring intently at the small door. The whole group had gathered, and now Jessica looked around at them with a grin, put her hand on the little doorknob, and pulled. Hey, Ashley King. Magically, it opened. The door revealed a small, sunken room. Jessica shone the light around it. It was full of equipment. One wall was covered in TV screens. Must be CCTV, Lamar said. Come on, Jessica handed her the flashlight to Charlie and swung her legs through the door. There was one deep step leading down to the room, which was no bigger than a large refrigerator turned on its side. That's a little too cramped for me. I'll keep looking around here, John saluted, then turned as though to stand guard. This is like a clown car, Marla remarked as she jostled against Charlie. The space was too cramped for all of them, but they crowded together. Jason sat on the step, feeling more comfortable by the exit. There were 8 of the television screens across the wall, each with its own little panel of buttons and knobs. Sticking out beneath them was a panel, almost a table, covered in buttons. They were large and black, unlabeled, and spaced in an irregular series. The other wall was blank, except for a single large switch by the door. What's this do? Jason said, and he put his hand on the switch. He hesitated just long enough for someone to stop him, then pulled it. The lights came on. What? Cawthon looked to the others frantically. They all started to one another in a confused silence. Jason climbed up and poked his head out into the main room. They're on out here too. Some of them at least, he said too loudly. Why is there power? Jessica whispered, reaching over Jason to pull the door closed again. How is that possible? Charlie said. This place hasn't been open in 10 years. Cool. Marla leaned forward, studying the monitors as though expecting some sort of answer to be revealed. Turn on the TVs, Jason said suddenly. I can't reach. Jessica flipped onto the first TV and static crackled across the screen. Nothing? Charlie asked impatiently. Just a sec. She twisted the dial, wiggling it back and forth until an image emerged. It was the stage centered on Bonnie. Must be the security cameras. The other animals weren't visible. Jessica turned on the rest of the TVs, adjusting them until the pictures became clear, although most were still poorly lit. They still work, Charlie said, almost under her breath. Maybe, Jessica said. Hey, someone go out there. See if the camera is live. Okay, Marla said, after a brief hesitation, wriggling her way to the exit and awkwardly climbing over Jason. A moment later, she appeared on camera, on stage beside Bonnie. Marla waved. She appeared multicolored as the stage lights bathed her in purple, green, and yellow from different sides. Can you see me? She asked. Yeah, Carlton shouted, while Marla was staring at the buttons. What do these do? He said with a wicked grin, pressing one. Marla screamed. Marla, are you okay? Charlie shouted. What happened? Marla was standing still on stage, but she had backed away from Bonnie and was staring at him as if he might bite. He moved. He moved, Marla yelled. Bonnie moved. What do you do? Marla, Jessica yelled, laughing. It's okay. We pushed a button. Lamar pressed the button again, and they all watched the screen this time. Sure enough, Bonnie turned stiffly to one side. He pressed it again, and the rabbit swiveled back to face the absent audience again. Try another one, Carlton said. Go ahead, Lamar said, and climbed out of the little room to join Marla on stage. He crouched down to inspect Bonnie's feet. They're attached to a swiveling panel, he called. Yeah? Jessica called, not really listening. Carlton started pressing buttons as the rest of them watched the cameras. After a moment, Charlie left the room as well. It's too stuffy in here, she explained. Jessica's perfume and Carlton's hair gel, both of which smelled nice enough out in the open, were starting to form a sticky miasma. She stepped out into the open to watch them experiment with the animals on stage. Most of the dining room was still dark. There were 3 colored spotlights suspended from the ceiling, aiming beams of purple, yellow, and green at the stage. The animals were cast now in unnatural colors. And dust in the beams of light shone like tiny stars, so many that it was difficult to see through them. The floor beneath the long tables was dusted with glitter that had fallen from the party hats, and that as she looked around, she noticed again the drawings that lined the walls of the place, all at the height of children's eyes. They had always been there, and Charlie wondered now where her father had gotten the first ones when the restaurant opened. Had he used her own childish scribblings, or had he made them himself and stuck them up? Forgeries to encourage actual children to display their art? The thought of her father hunched over his workbench, gripping an unsteady crayon with hands accustomed to manipulating microchips, made her want to giggle. She noticed the flashlight still on in the center of the room and went to switch it off. Don't waste the battery, she said in her head, in chorus with Aunt Jen's voice. She turned her attention to the stage. It looked like the others had gotten Chica and Bonnie to go through a series of small specific movements. They could each swivel their entire bodies back and forth, and their hands, feet, and heads could be moved in various directions, but each movement was separate. Charlie went to the back of the control room and stuck her head in. Can you make them do the dance? She asked. I don't know how, Carlton said, leaning back away from the monitors. All of this must have been used to program the dances. I don't think someone was in here manually controlling everything during the shows. He shook his head with certainty. That would have been impossible. Huh? Charlie said. Everyone quiet, Marla called out, and they all felt silent. For a long moment there was no sound. Then Lamar said, What? Marla frowned, tilting her head to the side, listening for something. I thought I heard something, she said finally. It was like pings of a music box. Her mouth barely moved as she spoke. It's gone. Why isn't Freddy moving? Charlie asked. I don't know, Carlton said. I can't find the controls for him. Jessica said, tapping the monitors. These cameras don't show the whole place. Charlie peered at them, but they were mixed up in no logical order. She couldn't piece together a picture of the whole restaurant. There's 3 cameras on the stage, 1 on each animal, but there should be 1 on the whole thing. Jessica was swaying. There's the entrance to the kitchen, but not the kitchen itself. and you can't see the hallway and the room with the little stage where we were at last night. Maybe the cameras are just in the main room, Carlton suggested. Nope, said Jessica. There are cameras everywhere out there. So, Carlton said. So there's gotta be another control room, Jessica said triumphantly. Maybe down the hall by the other stage? Charlie went back out into the main room again. She was feeling restless, less excited by the discoveries than the... 2 pages. Separate already. Come on. There we go. Than the others. Though she was not sure why, she watched the stage Carlton was still playing with the buttons. Bonnie and Chica jerking in small, disjointed motions as Freddy Fazbear remained motionless. His eyes half closed and his mouth slack slightly open. Hey, Lamar said suddenly. Marla, the music, I hear it now. Everyone was silent again. Then Marla shook her head. Creepy, she said. More excited this time, rubbing her hands together as though they were sharing campfire stories. Lamar looked thoughtfully at Freddy. Let's go find the other control room, Jessica said, emerging with a determined look on her face. Okay, Marla jumped from the stage to join them, and they started scanning the rest of the stage looking for a second door. I'm staying in here, Jason called from the first room. This is so cool. Chica swiveled back and forth rapidly on the stage as he pushed her buttons repeatedly. Lamar went to join Jason. Okay, my turn, he said, leaning on the door. He went in, not waiting for Jason's response. Charlie stayed where she was, still staring at Freddy, frozen in the middle of his act. John came up next to her, and she felt a flash of irritation, and she did not want to be cajoled into joining in the search. He stood there for a moment, looking at Freddy, and then leaned in close to her and whispered, I'm counting to 100, you'd better hide. Surprised out of her thoughts, she looked at him for a moment, her irritation broken. He winked at her, then covered his eyes. It was absurd. It was childish, and in that moment, it was the only thing she wanted to do. Slightly giddy, Charlie took off looking for a place to hide. Jason pushed the series of buttons again with increasing frustration. I'm bored now, he announced. How can you be bored, Lamar said, wide-eyed. They aren't working anymore. Jason continued to press buttons, no longer watching the monitors. Lamar studied the monitor. Bonnie's head was up and turned to the side, his eyes appearing to watch the camera. Well, go find your sister then, he told Jason. I don't need her permission to be bored. Impatiently, Jason climbed up out of the control room. Everyone is so sensitive, Lamar muttered. Suddenly, realizing he was alone in the control room, he climbed out, but Jason was already gone. Jessica was leading the exploration party, heading toward the little stage they had discovered the night before. Marla looked back and saw Jason skipping to catch up just before they disappeared into the long hall. Hey, be careful, she called over her shoulder as Jason branched off in his own direction. Lamar caught up to the group and followed them on their way into the hall. The main dining room was empty now, though Jason could still hear Charlie and John's playful shouts, echoing from the party rooms that extended off the main building. Left alone, Jason headed straight for the arcade. It was more dimly lit than the rest of the place, and without power, the arcade machines appeared as towering black monoliths in a forgotten graveyard. The air was stale and thin. Jason went to the nearest console and pressed a few buttons, some stuck with age, but nothing happened. Plug it in, duh. He ducked beneath the games to check, but even though the mounds were of wire seemingly impossibly... He ducked behind the games to check, but even though the mounds of wire seemed impossibly tangled, it looked like they were plugged in. Maybe there's a switch for the whole room. He started checking the walls. There was no obvious switch, but as Jason scanned the walls, he became distracted by the children's drawings taped in clusters. Jason was too young to have any memories of his own from being at Freddy's. Even Hurricane itself was no more than a hazy set of impressions. But something about the pictures brought up a sense of nostalgia. They were all the same, really, the kinds of drawings he and every other kid had done. figures with circles for bodies and sticks for arms in a multitude of colors. Only a few details showed which figures were animals. Chica with her beak, Bonnie with his ears. It seemed like there had been a bit more attention paid to the drawings of Freddy Fazbear. They were a little better. The children had been a little more careful to make the details right. Jason found himself looking at one drawing in particular. It was the same as the others, maybe a little better. Bonnie the bunny hugging a child. There was no name at the bottom. Jason took the picture off the wall, uncertain why this one in particular interested him so much. John burst into the room with a wide grin and a deep breath. But then, seeing that it was only Jason inside, he quickly returned to a stoic demeanor. "What's up?" He nodded his head, playing it cool, then casually stepped away before silently returning to a sprint. Playing hide-and-seek like babies, Jason thought. I hope I never fall in love. He looked back down at the drawing and squinted as though not seeing correctly. The child was now facing away from Bonnie. Jason started for a moment. Wasn't he hugging Bonnie before? He looked out at the main room, but Marla was out of sight, looking for the control room. Jason folded the drawing carefully and put it in his pocket. It was suddenly apparent how quiet it had become outside. Jason stepped out timidly and peeked into the dining room. "Guys," he whispered, looking back once more, then ventured out to find the group. Okay. Jessica, Lamar, Carlton, and Marla were still creeping slowly through the other half of the building. The spotlights from the dining room didn't reach this far, only assenting edges and corners of specks of glitter. Jessica scanned the wall with her flashlight, looking for breaks in the plaster, and motioned to Marla to do the same. "We have to check for a hidden door," she said. The last one wasn't really hidden, Carla pointed out. "Yeah," Jessica conceded, but she kept her light on the wall, clearly not ready to give up the hunt. They passed 2 bathrooms they had not noticed the night before. "Do you think the plumbing still works?" Carlton said. "I really need to pee." "What are you, 5 years old? I don't want to hear that." Jessica rolled her eyes and walked faster. When they got into the room with the little stage, everyone stopped. Marla and Lamar went closer to the stage, drawing together slightly as if unaware they were doing it. Even though Carlton and Jessica had been here the night before, it was as though they were seeing it anew through Marla and Lamar's eyes. They still had not seen what was behind the curtain, Carlton realized suddenly. "I remember these posters," Lamar said. "I remember this too," Marla said, pointing to the sign that read, "Out of Order," strung across the stage. "My whole life, I felt uneasy when I've seen that phrase, even if it's just at a vending machine," she laughed insecurely. "I know what you mean," Lamar said softly. But before he could go on, Carlton interrupted. "Found it." "Maybe," Jessica amended. There was a door close set into the wall like the one below the stage. Not quite hidden, but not meant to be noticed. It was painted black, like the walls of the room. Jessica turned the knob and pulled, but it was stuck tight. "Locked?" Lamar said. "I don't think so." "Let me try," Marla said. She grabbed the knob and yanked, and it came open, sending her stumbling back. "Impressive," Lamar said. "Yeah, well, taking care of Jason makes me tough." Marla grinned as she knelt down to squeeze through the small door. It was almost the same as the first room, a set of 8 TV screens and a large panel of unmarked black buttons. Carlton fumbled to find the master switch, reaching his hand into a dark corner. Then with a click, the power came on, and a soft buzzing sound filled the room. Rich, bizarre reds and blues began streaming under the door from the stage lights. Outside, Jessica and Carlton began switching televisions on. I'm sorry. They fiddled with the knobs until they were showing pictures. Though most were very dark, from here they could see a long shot of the main stage, just as in the other room. but the rest of the cameras were showing other places and angles. While the first control room had only shots of the main dining room, here they could see into other areas of the restaurant. The private party rooms, which were set up with glittery decorations for events that would never happen, hallways, an office, and even what looked like a storage closet. The room behind them was visible, as well as the camera trained on the out of order sign, now lit with otherworldly shades, and the curtain behind it. On one screen, they could see Jason ducking back into the arcade. Maybe I should go get him, Marla said, but no one responded. Carlton started pressing buttons. Spotlights appeared and vanished onto the stage in the main dining room as he did, illuminating first one animal and then another, lighting up empty spaces where someone might once have stood. He flipped the switch, and it seemed for a moment that nothing happened. Then Lamar started laughing, pointing at one of the screens. The pizza decorations lining the walls were spinning wildly, as though they might leap off and go rolling away. I forgot they used to do that, Lamar said, as Carlton brought them slowly to a halt. There was a large black dial to one side of the buttons, and Carlton spun it, but it seemed to do nothing. Let me try, Lamar said. He elbowed Carlton into the side and pressed another button. There was a high-pitched whine. They all jumped, and it quickly faded down to a static hum. Lamar pressed the button again, and the sound was gone. I guess we know what turns the speakers on, Carlton said. I bet we could figure out how to play the music, Jessica said. She reached forward and pushed something else, and stage lights popped up while the main lights dimmed. The figures on this main stage suddenly stood out a little, commanding attention. She pushed it again, and the lights faded back to normal. I love that, Carlton said. What? Marla asked Marla. The stage lights, he said. One switch, and it's like a whole nother world up there. Another button flickered. The stage lights on and off in the room behind them, while another started and stopped the little merry-go-round. Its tinkling music grinding too slowly, like the ride itself was trying to remember how the song went. They managed to get the speakers on again without the feedback whine, but there was still only static. I have an idea, Jessica said. Pushing to the front of the group, she switched on the static, then started turning the knob back and forth. The hum grew louder in pitch, then higher, responding to her adjustments. Progress, Carlton said. It's still just static, Marla said, unimpressed. Jessica turned it lower again, then snatched her hand from the dial like she had been bitten and punched the button shutting the speakers off. What? Marla asked. Jessica remained motionless, her hands still suspended in the air. What happened? Did it shock you? Carlton asked. It sounded like a voice, Jessica answered. What did it say? Marla asked, apparently interested again. I don't know. Let me try again. She turned the speaker on again, calling forth the static and lowered the hum, as they all listened, intent on the sound. As it sank to a lower register just below the range of a human voice, they all heard it. Grinding and broken words, almost too slow and distorted to be considered speech. They looked at one another. What on earth? Marla said. No, it's just random static, Lamar said. He reached for the controls and dialed the pitch back up slowly. For another fleeting moment, there was a purposeful sound. That sounded like singing, Carlton said. No, Lamar said, sounding more unsure this time. Do it again, Marla said. Lamar did, but this time the static was empty. Is that Charlie? Marla suddenly became focused on a blurry figure moving down the dark hall towards them, sliding along the wall as though to remain unnoticed. Charlie was hurrying, almost skipping as trying to find another place to hide. She glanced beside her, vaguely suspecting that John might be cheating. She moved through the darkness and toward the colorful glow of the small stage curtain, which was throwing eerie reds and blues onto the tables and party hats. Going down this passage had always felt like a long and perilous journey, one not to be made alone. She kept her gaze fixed behind her, letting the wall beside her guide her step. She knew John was close, probably creeping on her in the dark. Suddenly, she backed into something, stopping short. She had been moving faster than she thought, or more likely the hall was not as long as she remembered. She saw his shadow at the end of the hall. If he turned his head, he would see her. Without thinking, Charlie climbed up onto the platforms that she had bumped into and ducked behind the curtain, tucking herself between the wall and a large, bulky prop, trying not to breathe. Charlie? He called, still far away. Charlie! Charlie felt her heart beat quicken. There had been boys she liked now and then, but this was something different. She wanted him to find her, but not quite yet. As she waited, her eyes adjusted to the darkness, and she was able to make out the shape of the curtain and the edge of the stage. She looked up at the object in front of her. No! Her body shuddered, then froze. It was standing over her. It was the thing from her father's workshop. The misshapen thing that hung in the corner, shaken by random convulsions as its eyes burned silver. Does it hurt? Now it was still, and its eyes were blank and dull. It was staring straight ahead, insensate, and its arms with its hook hung useless at its side. She recognized his eyes, but he was somehow worse now. Encased in hollow body parts and matted with red fur, with a stench of oil and glue, he had a name now. They called him Foxy, but she knew better. Charlie shrank away, pressing against the wall. Her heart was racing and her breath was shallow, too fast. Her arm had been touching its leg, and now she felt a sudden itchiness from it, like she had been contaminated. She wiped her hand violently against her shirt as she started to panic. Run! She sprang away from it, pushing off to the wall to get away, to move before it saw her. But the edge of the stage caught her foot. She stumbled forward, momentarily becoming entangled in the curtain. She struggled to get free when suddenly the thing's arm jerked up, and the hook slashed at her arm. She ducked away too late, and it cut her. The pain was shocking, like freezing water. She tripped backward and felt herself falling for long seconds, and then she was caught. Charlie, are you okay? It was John. He had caught her. She tried to nod, but she was shaking. She looked at her arm. There was a cut above her elbow, almost 4 inches long. It was bleeding freely, and she covered it with her hand, the gaps between her fingers welling over as her blood leaked through. Her own blood leaked through. What happened? Marla asked, rushing up behind her. Charlie, I'm so sorry. I must have hit a button that caused it to move. Are you okay? Charlie nodded, a little less shaky. I'm fine, she said. It's not that bad. She moved her arm around experimentally. See? No nerve damage, she said. I'll be fine. Carlton, Jessica, and Lamar came hurrying out of the control room. We should take her to the ER, Carlton said. I'm fine, Charlie insisted. She stood up, refusing John's help, and braced herself on the stage for a moment. She heard her Aunt Jen's voice in her head. How much blood have you lost? You don't need to go to a hospital. She could move her arm just fine, and she would not bleed to death from this. She felt dizzy, though. Come on. Here we go. Charlie, you look like a ghost, John said. We need to get you out of here. Okay, she said. Her thoughts were scattered, and the injury hurt less than it should have. She took deep breaths as they headed for the exit, grounding it herself. John handed her a piece of cloth, and she put it to the cut to slow the bleeding. Thanks, she said, looking at him. Something was missing. Was that your tie? She asked, and she shrugged. Do I look like a tie person? She grinned. I thought it looked good on you. Jason! Marla yelled as they passed the arcade. Move it, or I'm leaving you behind. Jason ran to catch up. Is Charlie okay? He said anxiously. Marla caught her breath and put her arm around him. She's fine, she reassured him. They walked briskly down the same corridor that they entered through. Jason looked back as he was being guided out, studying the pictures on the wall once more before losing sight of them. The colorful lights from the stage were fading, and the flashlight was throwing shapes and shadows on everything, making the drawings difficult to see. But Jason could swear he saw the figures moving in the pictures. They all hurried back through the empty building and out to the parking lot, not keeping watch for the guard. When they made it out of the car, Lamar, who had grabbed the big flashlight, flipped it on and shone it at Charlie's arm. She looked down at the cut. Do you need stitches? Marla asked. I am so sorry. Charlie. We were all being careless. It's not your fault, Charlie said. She knew she sounded annoyed, but she didn't mean to. Her voice was tight and clipped with pain. The shock had worn off, but that meant the wound would begin to hurt. It's fine, Charlie said, and after a long moment, the others gave in somewhat reluctantly. We should at least give you some stuff to clean that up, and a bandage it, Marla said, wanting to do something to atone, however small. There's a 24-hour drugstore just off the main road, Carlton offered. Charlie, why don't you go with Marla and I'll drive your car back to the motel, Jessica said. I'm fine, Charlie protested half-heartedly. But she handed Jessica the keys. You're a good driver, right? Jessica rolled her eyes. People from New York know how to drive, Charlie. Personally, I don't think so. John lingered a moment as Charlie was getting into Marla's car. She smiled at him. I'm fine, she said. I'll see you tomorrow. He looked at her like there was something more he wanted to say, but he just nodded and left. Okay, Marla said, to the drugstore. Charlie twisted in her seat to look at Jason. Did you have fun? She asked. The games don't work, he said, obviously preoccupied. The drugstore was only a few minutes away. You stay in the car, Marla commanded to Jason as they pulled to a stop. Don't leave me out here, Jason pleaded. I told you to stay, she repeated, a little confused by the fear in his voice. He didn't answer, and she and Charlie headed inside. As soon as they were gone, Jason pulled the drawing out of his pocket. He held it up under the faint light of the parking lot to examine. It had not changed back. Bonnie the bunny was reaching towards the child who was facing away from him. Curious, Jason scrapped at the crayon lines with his fingernail. The wax came off easily, leaving its trace on the paper. As soon as Marla passed into the fluorescent-lit, air-controlled drugstore, she sighed and put her hand on her temples. Oh, he's such a little brat, she said. I like him, Charlie said honestly. She was still using John's tie to stanch the bleeding, and now, in brighter light, she peeled it back to see the cut. The bleeding had almost stopped, and it was not as bad as it first appeared, though the tie was irreparably ruined. Hey, she said, how come you brought Jason anyway? Marla didn't answer right away, setting her sights on the first aid aisle and heading for it. Here we are, she said. What do you think, gauze? Sure, but don't call me gauze. Sure, but don't call me gauze. Charlie leaned into Marla, but was ignored. Antiseptic, Marla continued, grabbing the items. The thing is, she said, so Jason's dad and our mom have been married since before he was born. I mean, obviously, and they're probably getting divorced. I know about it, but Jason doesn't. Oh no, Charlie said. They're fighting all the time, Marley went on, and it scares him, you know? I mean, my dad left when I was still a little kid, so I grew up with that. I was used to it. Plus, I got to have a great stepdad, but for him, it's gonna feel like the end of the world, and they're sure not doing anything to make it easier. They're fighting right in front of us, so I didn't want to leave him alone with that for a week. I'm so sorry, Marla, Charlie said. Yeah, it's okay, Marla said. I'm leaving in a year anyway. I'm just worried about the brat out there. He's not really a brat, Charlie said, and Marla grinned. I know, he's pretty great, right? I kinda like having him around. They paid for the supplies. The clerk, a teenage boy, didn't bat an eye at Charlie's moderately blood-splattered appearance. Outside, they sat on the hood of the car. Marla started to open the bottle of antiseptic, but Charlie held out a hand for it. I can do it myself, she said. Marla looked like she was about to argue, but she swallowed whatever she was about to say and handed Charlie the bottle and a piece of gauze. As Charlie awkwardly cleaned her arm, Marla smiled impishly. Speaking of people we like having around, are you having fun with John? Ow, that stings, and I don't know what you mean, Charlie said primly, suddenly putting all her attention on her task. You do too. He's following you around like a little puppy, and you're loving it. You are loving it. Charlie bit back a smile. How about you and Lamar? She retorted. Me and who now? Marla said. Here. She held out a hand for the bloody gauze, and Charlie handed it to her, reaching for a clean strip. You're going to have to let me tape it, Marla said. Charlie nodded and held the gauze in place as Marla reached for the tape. Come on, Charlie went on. I see the way you look at him. Nope, Marla smoothed down the last piece of tape and put everything back in the bag. Seriously, Charlie said as they got back into the car. You're adorable together, and your names are anagrams of each other. Marla and Lamar. It's meant to be. Both laughing, they headed back to the motel. Okay, that's the end of chapter 4. Took me like 47 and a half minutes to get this far. Let me see now. Okay. How many pages we got left? 30. Good grief, I still got a big chunk. Chapter 5. When they got to the motel, Jessica was already there, and so was John. He stood up when Charlie walked in. I was worried about you. I thought maybe I could sleep on the floor. He waited nervously for her reaction, as though he had realized only upon seeing her that he might have overstepped her boundaries. Why do I keep yawning? I'm supposed to be reading. On another day, in another place, Charlie might have been annoyed by his excessive concern. But here in Hurricane, she was glad to have it. We should all be together, she thought. It's safer. She wasn't really afraid, but unease still clung to her like cobwebs, and John's presence had been a calming one ever since they arrived. She was still looking at her, waiting for a response, and she smiled at him. As long as you don't mind sharing the floor with Jason, she said. He grinned. Just let me have a pillow and I'll be fine. Marla tossed him one, and he stretched elaborately, set it on the ground, and lay down. They all went to bed almost immediately. Charlie was exhausted. Now that her injury had been cleaned and bound, the adrenaline of the night left her body all at once, leaving her drained and a little shaky. She didn't even bother changing into pajamas. She just collapsed on the bed next to Jessica and was asleep in seconds. Charlie woke just after dawn when the sky was still pale and a little pink. She looked around the room. The others wouldn't be up for hours, she suspected, but she was too alert to try and to fade back to sleep. She grabbed her shoes and, stepping over Jason and John's sleeping bodies, went outside. The motel was set a little way back off the road. Trees spread around thickly around it and bent round and behind it. Charlie sat down on the curb to put her shoes on, wondering if she could go for a walk in the woods without getting lost. The air was crisp, and she felt renewed and energized by the brief night's sleep. Her arm hurt, a dull and pulsing pain that kept her drawing her attention, but it had not bled through the bandages. Charlie usually found it easy to ignore pain when she knew she was not in danger from it. The woods were inviting, and she decided to risk getting lost. As she was about to stand, John sat down beside her. "Morning," he said. His clothes were rumpled from his night on the motel floor, and his hair was a mess. Charlie held back a laugh. "What?" he said. She shook her head. "You look a little like your old self today," she said. He looked down at himself and shrugged. "Clothes don't make the man." "What are you doing up so early?" "I don't know. Couldn't sleep. What about you?" "Somebody stepped on me." Charlie winced. "Sorry," she said and laughed. "I'm just kidding. I was awake. I was going to go for a walk," she said, pointing at the tree line. "Out there somewhere. Do you want to come?" "Yeah, definitely." They headed into the woods, and John hung back for a moment and surreptitiously retucked his shirt, trying to smooth out the wrinkles. Charlie pretended not to notice. There was no path, and so they made their way through the trees at random, glancing back now and then to be sure they could still make out the motel parking lot. John stumbled over a fallen branch, and Charlie reached out with her good arm to catch him before he fell. "Thanks," he said. "Strong arm, too." "Well, you caught me yesterday, so it's only fair that I catch you back. Now we're even," she said. She looked around. The motel was scarcely in sight, and she felt concealed, made safe by the woods. She could say anything here, and it would be all right. She leaned back against a tree, picking idly at the bark behind her. Freddy's wasn't the first restaurant," she said it abruptly, surprising herself, and John looked at her quizzically, like he had not quite heard her. She didn't want to say it again, but she forced herself to. "Freddy's. It wasn't my dad's first restaurant. There was a diner, a little one. It was before my mom left." "I had no idea," John said slowly. "Where was it?" "I don't know. It's one of those memories from when you were a little kid, you know? You only remember the things that are right around you. I remember the linoleum on the kitchen floor. It was this black and white diamond pattern, but I don't remember where the restaurant was or what it was called." "Yeah," John said. "We took a vacation to a theme park where I was like 3, and all I remember is the back seat of the car. So were they there?" His voice dropped a little quieter when he said it. Almost reflexively, Charlie nodded. "Yeah, there was a bear and a rabbit, I think. Sometimes the details get mixed up in my head. They're not like normal memories," she said, needing him to understand the story's defect before she told him the rest. "It's like you have a realistic dream, and in the morning you're not sure if it really happened or not. It's just impressions, like, oh, it's just impressions, little snatches of time. She trailed off. She wasn't explaining it right. She was choosing all the wrong words. She was reaching back too far in her memory to a time where she did not yet speak. It was a time when she did not have the words to name the things she saw. And so now, she tried to recall them. The words could never be right. She looked at John. He was watching her patiently, waiting for her to go on. She wanted to tell him this story from her life that she had never told. It was not even a story, not really, just something that nagged at the edge of her mind, something flashing by randomly in the corner of her eye. She was not entirely certain it was real, and so she told no one. She wanted to tell John because she wanted to speak it to another person. But she looked at her with trusting eyes, and she knew he would listen to and believe her, because he had cared for her for a long time ago. Because he had caught her when she fell, and he had come here to sleep and keep watch all night. And though a pragmatic, slightly cruel part of her, because she was not part of her real life, she could tell him anything. And when she returned home, it would be as tough as though it had never happened. She wanted suddenly to touch him, have confirmation that he was really there, that this was not another dream. She reached out her hand to him, and surprised but glad, he took it. He stayed where he was, as if afraid that moving in closer would scare her. They stayed that way for a moment, and then she let go. And she told him the story the way she spoke it in her head, the memories of a small child mixing with the things she had come to understand as she grew older. Cool. There was another restaurant, rustic and small, with red checkered cloths on the table, and a kitchen you could see into from the dining area. They all were together, her father and her mother and us. When Charlie was very, very young, she was never alone. There was Charlie, and there was a little boy so close to Charlie that remembering him was like remembering a part of herself. They were always together. She learned to say we before she learned to say I. They played together on the floor of the kitchen, sometimes drawing pictures while hiding under a hardwood table. She remembered the shuffling of feet and the shadows of customers walking by. Light was broken by a slowly turning fan that thrown across the floor in ribbons. She remembered the smell of an ashtray and a hearty laughter of adults lost in a good story while their children played. Very often, she would hear her father's laugh echoing from a distant corner as he talked with customers. When Charlie pictured him laughing like that now, it was a little ache, a sucking feeling in the center of her chest, because his eyes were bright and his smile was easy, and because he wanted them all to be a part of the restaurant, to share his work freely, because he was not afraid to let his children roam and explore. He was yet untouched by grief, and so while he looked a little like the father she truly remembered, he was not the same man at all. Charlie was looking down at the ground as she talked, at the dirt and stones and cracked remains of leaves, and her hand was at her back, stripping back bark from the tree. Does that hurt the tree, she thought, and forced her hand away, not nodding them in front of her. The restaurant was open until late at night, and so when they began to falter, Charlie and the little boy would crawl into the pantry with blankets and soft toys to sleep until it was time to close. She remembered using sacks of flour as pillows big bags almost as long as they were tall. They would snuggle down together and whisper words of nonsense that meant deep things only to the two of them. And Charlie would drift into sleep, half listening to the warm sounds of the restaurant, the clank of dishes, and the murmuring of grown-up talk, and the sound of the bear and the rabbit as they danced to their chiming tunes. They loved the animals, the yellowish-brown bear and the matching rabbit, who had wandered the restaurant, dancing and singing for the customers, and sometimes just for Charlie and the little boy. They sometimes moved stiffly and mechanically, and sometimes with fluid human movements. Wait a minute. Mechanically and sometimes with... Oh my god. And while the boy liked the animals best when they acted like people, Charlie liked them the other way. Their stilted up movements, their lifeless eyes, their occasional glitches fascinated her. They acted alive, but were not. The narrow yet bottomless chasm between those things, alive and not alive, enthralled her, though she would never have been able to explain why. I think they were costumes, Charlie said now, still looking down at the ground. The animals weren't always robots. The bear and the bunny were costumes, and sometimes people wore them, and sometimes my father put it onto one of the robots, and you could always tell which it was by the way they dance. Charlie stopped. There was more, but she could not bring herself to speak. There was something else that made her lock down her mind and force the memory away. The part that made her unwilling to ask Aunt Jen for answers because she was afraid of what those answers might be. Charlie had not dared to look at John the whole time she was talking, staring only at the ground, at her hands, at her sneakers. Now she did not look at him. And he was rapt, seeming almost to be holding his breath. He waited, not wanting to speak until he was sure she was finished. That's all I remember, she said at last, even though it was a lie. Wait, who was the little boy? Who was the little boy? Charlie shook her head, frustrated that he had not understood. He was mine, she said. I mean, he was my brother. We were the same. She was speaking childishly as if the memory had taken hold of her, forcing her to regret. She cleared her throat. Sorry, she said, speaking more slowly and trying to choose her words with care. I think he was my twin brother. She saw Johnny open his mouth, about to ask the question. What happened to him? But there must have been something in her face, something warning, because he held it back and said instead, do you think that place was around here? I mean, I guess it could have been anywhere, another state even. I don't know, Charlie said, slowly looking over her shoulder. Then, up in the trees, this all feels the same. It feels like I could walk around any corner and it could be there. Her voice began to break. I want to find it, she added suddenly, and as soon as she said it, it was what she wanted to do. Well, what do you remember about it? John said enthusiastically, almost lunging forward like an eager dog on a lead. He must have been dying to go looking from the moment she mentioned the place. Charlie smiled but shook her head. Why do I keep yawning? I really don't remember much, she said. I don't know how much help I can actually be. Like I said, the things I remember are just little scraps. They're not information, it's like a picture book. She closed her eyes, trying to see the place in her mind's eye. The floor would shake. She lifted her head as though it became clear. A train? She asked, as though Johnny would know. I remember his thunderous sound every day. It was the biggest sound I'd ever heard. I don't mean loud. I mean you could feel it in your whole body, like it was rumbling right through your chest. It must have been close to some tracks then, right? Johnny said. Yeah, Charlie said with a spark of hope. There was a tree out in front, she went on. It looked like an owl, it looked like an old angry monster hunched forward and wizened, with two giant gnarled branches reaching out like arms. Whenever we left for the night, I hid my face in my father's shirt so I wouldn't have to see it as we walked by. What else? John said. Were there stores or other restaurants? No, I mean, I don't think so. I'm sorry, she scratched her head. It's gone. It's not enough, John said, a little frustrated. It could be anywhere. A train and a tree. There must be something you can remember, right? I mean, anything? No, Charlie said. The more she pushed herself to remember, the harder it got. She was grasping blindly, and it was like trying to get a hold of living creatures, as if the memories saw her coming and slipped away. She tossed out fragments as she managed to catch them. The tablecloths, red and white, checked and made for real cloth, not plastic. She remembered grabbing at one, unsteady on her feet, and the whole table falling down on top of her, plates and glasses shattering around her like she covered her as she covered her head. Charlotte, are you okay? Her father's voice seemed clearer than ever. There was a squeaky floorboard in the corner of the diner that Charlie liked to push on, making it sing as if it made music. There was a picnic table out back where they used to sit in the sun, one leg of it sinking in the soft ground. There was the song of her parents used to sing in the car whenever they came home from a trip. They would burst into it when they were a little way from home, and then they'd start laughing as if they had done something clever. It's nothing helpful, Charlie said. Just kid stuff. She felt a little lightheaded. She had spent so many years avoiding these memories, her mind shied away as if from snakes. Having done it, she felt strange and a little guilty, like she had done something wrong. But she also felt something that might have been joy, in the things she never allowed herself to think of. The memories of that time were unsafe. There were traps and snares wrought into their very substance, but there was precious things among them. Sorry, she said, can't remember more. No, that's really impressive. I can't believe you remember that far back at all, he said. I didn't mean to push you, he added, a little sheepishly, then looked thoughtful. What was the song? I think it was the same one they danced to at Freddy's, Charlie said. No, the one your parents sang in the car. Oh, she said. I don't know if I remember it. It wasn't really a song, you know. It was just a little line. She closed her eyes, picturing a car, trying to envision the backs of her parents' heads as though they were still in the back seat. She were still in the back seat. She waited, trusting her mind to give it up, and after a moment it did. She hummed it, just 6 notes. We're back in harmony, she sang. And they'd harmonize, she added. Embarrassed by her parents, even now, John's expression was blank for a moment, as the words at first seemed meaningless, but then his eyes lit with promise. Charlie, there's a town north of here called New Harmony. Oh, we're back in harmony. There's a town north of here called New Harmony. Huh? Was all she said. For a moment, she listened to the words in her head, wanting them to set off an inspiration, trip a memory, but they did not. I feel like that should ring a bell, but it doesn't, she said. Sorry. I mean, it doesn't sound wrong, but it doesn't sound right either. She was disappointed, but John still had that thoughtful look on his face. Come on, he said. Extending his hand, Charlie wiped her cheek and took a shady breath and then looked at him. She nodded with an exhausted smile and got to her feet. Should we wait for everyone to wake up? John said as they emerged into the parking lot after a brisk walk back. No, Charlie said with an unexpected vehemence. I don't want everyone there for this, she added in softer tones. Just the thought of the whole group going along made her anxious. It was too risky, too private. She had no idea what they might find or what it might do to her. And she couldn't abide the thought of making those discoveries with an audience. Okay, John said, just us then. Just us. Charlie went inside and grabbed her car keys, moving slowly as though not to disturb the others. As she was heading back to the door, Jason stirred and opened his eyes, looking up at her like she wasn't quite sure who she was. She put a finger to her lips. He nodded sleepily and closed his eyes again. Then she hurried out the door. She tossed the keys to John and got in on the passenger side. There's a map in here, she said, jostling. Wait, what? Alright. She tossed the keys to John and got. There's a map in here. There's a map in here, she said, jostling open the glove box door. The map fell out amid a pile of hand warmers and emergency food rations. Your aunt strikes again, John smiled. Charlie held the map just a few inches from her face. New Harmony was close, only about half an hour away. Think you can navigate? He asked. Aye, aye, Captain. Aye, Captain, Charlie said. Turn left out of the lot. Thanks, he said wearily. They drove back through the town and out the other side. The houses farther and farther between them as they went. Each one stood solitary, connected only by sagging power lines. Charlie watched the telephone poles and the dipping wires, repeating hypnotically as if they could go on forever. Then blinked, breaking the spell. Ahead of them, the mountains rose up, ancient and dark against the clear blue sky. They looked more solid than anything else around them. More real, and maybe they were. They had been here, watching long before the houses, long before the roads, and they would be here long after they were all gone. Nice day, John said, and she looked at him, tearing her gaze from the view. Yeah, Charlie said. I kind of forgot of how beautiful it is out here. Yeah, he said. He was quiet for a moment, then looked at her sideways, and Charlie couldn't tell if he was being shy or was just keeping his eyes on the road. It's weird, he said at last. When I was a kid, the mountains kind of scared me, especially when we were driving in the dark. They were like some monstrous beasts looming over us. He laughed a little, but Charlie did not. I know what you mean, she said, then grinning at him. I think they're pretty much just mountains, though. Hey, she said suddenly, you never told me what your story was about. My story? He flicked his eyes at her again, a little nervous. Yeah, you said you got a story published. What was it about? I mean, it was just a little magazine, just local, he said, still reluctant. Charlie waited, and finally he continued. It's called The Little Yellow House. It's about a boy, he said. He's 10 years old, his parents are fighting all the time, and he's afraid they're going to get divorced. They fight, and he overhears them saying awful things to each other, and he hides in his room with the door shut, but he can still hear them. So he starts looking out the window at the house across the street. They sort of keep their curtains open just enough that he can glimpse inside. He watches them go in and out of the house, this family, and he starts making up stories about them, imagining who they are and what they do. And after a while, they start feeling more real to him than his own family. He glanced at Charlie again, as if trying to gauge her reaction, and Charlie smiled, and he went on. So summer comes, and his family goes away for a week, and it's miserable. And when they get back, the family in the house across the street have moved away. There's nothing left, just a for sale sign hanging in front. Charlie nodded, waiting for him to continue, but he looked at her a little sheepishly. That's the end, he said. Oh, she said, that's really sad. He shrugged. I guess I'm not working on something happy now, though. What's that? He grinned at her. I guess I'm working on something happy now, though. What's that? He grinned at her. It's a secret. Charlie smiled back. It felt good to be out here, good to just be driving out into the horizon. She cranked the window down and pulled her arm out into the air, enjoying the feel of the rushing wind. It's not wind rushing, it's us, she thought. What about you, John? John said. What about me? Charlie said, still happily playing against the wind. Come on, what's the life of Charlie like these days? Charlie smiled at him and pulled her arm back into the car. I don't know. She said, pretty boring. There was a part of her that did not want to tell him for the same reason he wanted him with her now. He did not want her new life to mix with the old. But John had told her something real, something personal, and she felt like she owed him the same in return. It's alright, she said at last. My aunt is cool, even if she does sometimes look at me like she's not quite sure where I came from. School's fine, I have friends and all that, but it feels so temporary. I have another year, but I feel like I'm already gone. Gone where? John asked. Charlie struggled. I wish I knew. College, I guess? I'm not sure what comes next. Nobody ever knows what comes next, I guess, he said. He stopped himself, but she prodded him. Do I what? She said teasingly. Do I ever think of you? He flushed, and she instantly regretted the words. I was going to say, do you ever see your mom? He said quietly. Oh, she said. No, I don't. It exhausted Charlie to think of her mother. And though she thought her mother felt the same. Too much hug between them. Not quite blame, because neither of them were to blame for what happened, but nothing close to it. Their pain individual radiated off them both like auras, pushing at each other like magnets with the poles reversed, forcing them apart. Charlie? John was saying her name, and she looked over at him. Sorry, she said. I drifted for a second. You got any music in this car? He asked, and she nodded, eagerly seizing on the diversion. She bent over, picked up cassettes scattered on the floor, and started reading labels. He made fun of her tapes, and she argued back, and after some playful bickering, she shoved a tape into the player and settled back to stare out the window. I think this is where the map's usefulness ends, John gestured to the road ahead. The whole area is pretty much blank. I think what we're looking for isn't going to be on this map. He folded the map and tucked it neatly to the side of the seat, craning his neck out the window to see what they were passing. Yeah, she said, it looked like they had returned to civilization. Single houses littered the fields, and dirt roads branched off in all directions. The landscape was mostly bushes and short trees. The whole area nestled between rows of low-lying mountains. Oh, hi, Smileface. John looked at Charlie, hoping she would notice something that would point them in the right direction. Nothing? He said, though her blank stare had already given him the answer. No, she said plainly. She didn't want to elaborate. The houses became fewer and more scattered, and the fields of dry bushes seemed to stretch wider, giving the whole area a feeling. Oh, thanks, Smile. The houses became fewer and more scattered, and the fields of dry brush seemed to stretch wider, giving the whole area a feeling of desertion. John found himself glancing over at Charlie at short intervals, waiting for a signal, half expecting her to tell him to stop and turn around. But Charlie just stared into the darkness, her eyes fixed on nothing, resting her cheek in her mind. "Let's go back," she said finally, sounding resigned. "We could have missed something," John said. He slowed the car, looking for a spot to make a U-turn. "We missed a lot back there. Maybe it's down one of those dirt roads." Charlie laughed. "Really? You think we missed a lot?" She grew thoughtful. "No, none of this feels right. Nothing rings a bell." She felt a tear spill onto her cheek, and she wiped it away before John could notice. "Okay, no worries," Charlie said abruptly, pulling herself back from the reverie. "Let's grab a bite, just you and me." John smiled, still checking his mirrors for a place to turn. Charlie shivered. Then something caught her eye. She almost jumped in her seat, sitting straight up. "Stop!" she shouted. John slammed on the brakes, and the car skidded, dust billowing up all around the car. When they stopped, Charlie sat silently as John checked the rearview mirror again, his heart racing. "Are you okay?" he said, but Charlie was already out of the car. "Hey!" he called after her, scrambling out of his seat belt and rushing to lock the car behind him. Charlie was running back towards the town, but her eyes were on the field beside the road. He caught up before quickly trotting along beside her without asking questions. After a few minutes, Charlie slowed and began shuffling her feet on the ground, peering down as though she had lost something, small and valuable, in the dirt. "Charlie?" John said. Until this moment, he had not thought about what it was they were doing. It was an adventure, a chance to be alone with Charlie, to run off after a clue. But now she was starting to worry about him. He brushed his hair back from his face. "Charlie," he said, his voice touched with concern. "Thanks, guys." But Charlie did not look at him. She was intent on whatever she had found. "Right here," she said. She made a sharp turn around the edge of the road, somewhere where something protruded and snaked across the ground. John knelt carefully, brushing some of the loose dirt where his hand was exposing a flat metal beam. He kept going, uncovering a track that stretched across the road and went off into the field in both directions. It took him a moment to speak, but was as though the earth itself had tried to conceal it from them. "Be careful," he thought, with a minor pang of alarm, but he brushed aside the feeling. "I think we found your tracks," he said, looking up at Charlie, but she was nowhere in sight. "Charlie?" He took a quick look up and down the road, but there were no cars. "Charlie!" he called again, waving the dust away from his face and racing to catch up. When he reached her, he hung back a little, afraid to disturb her intense focus. There was a cluster of trees up ahead, gathered together as though around a campfire, tall and short or thick and scraggly. Charlie dragged her foot along the track as she walked, as if it might vanish if she ceased to touch it. "What is that? An old station?" John asked, squinting and blocking the sun with his hand. There was a long building nestled in the trees, its color blending in with the small grove, making it difficult to spot. The tracks veered away, heading off toward the mountains, and Charlie stopped dragging her foot along them, letting them go. John finally caught up, and they walked through the dry grass together toward the grove of the trees. Not far away now. There has to be a road. Charlie strayed almost randomly. Heading away from the building, John hesitated. But he gestured She gestured toward the building. This isn't security breach. This is the Silver Eyes. But he gestured toward the building, then followed her, looking back to make sure he knew the way back to the car. Before long, the ground leveled out beneath their feet. Old pavement broken with weeds and mounds of crumbling rock stretched across the field in a narrow, almost hidden path leading once again toward the small building. "This is it," Charlie said softly. John approached her carefully, then stood at her side. They walked the road together, dodging around pillars of grass that shot up from the breaks and holes. The tree was there, the one with reaching arms and ghastly face. But it was no longer frightening, no longer as Charlie remembered. It must have already been dead when she was a child. She realized. Its limbs had fallen off, leaving jagged holes where they had been, and they lay where they fell, rotting into the ground. That tree seemed a frail and weak shade of its former self, only recognizable by the stumps and bulges on its side that had made its face. Now even the face looked tired. The building itself was long and dilapidated. It was a single story, with a dark roof, weather-beaten walls. The place had once been painted red, but time and the sun and rain had won out over the paint. It was peeling and curling, whole long strips of it gone, the wood beneath showing, dark with what might be rot. Its foundations was overgrown with tall grass, and Charlie thought it looked as if it were sinking, as though the whole structure was slowly being swallowed by the earth. Charlie grabbed John's arm as they neared it, and then let it go and straightened her back. She felt as though she was preparing for a fight, as if the building itself might attack if it sensed weakness. Charlie went warily up in a few seconds to the door, sticking to the edges and testing the wood before she let down her full weight. The stairs held, but there were soft, splintered patches in the metal she didn't want to try. John didn't follow her right away, sidetracked by something nearly hidden in the grass. Charlie, he held it up, a battered metal sign with the painted... Wait. Did the music stop? Yeah, I think it stopped. Let me try again. Okay, I forgot to put it on repeat. Anyway, Charlie, he held it up. A battered metal sign with the painted words, Fredbear's Family Diner, in red script. Fredbear's Family Diner. Oh my. Charlie gave a gentle smile. Of course this is it. I'm home. John came up the stairs behind her and set the sign down carefully by the door, and they went inside. The door swung open easily. Light streamed in through the windows on all sides, revealing emptiness and decay. Unlike Freddy's, this place had been cleaned out. The wooden floors seemed intact, but they were warped from weather. Sunlight was streaming in, unobstructed, and went where it wanted without furniture or people to block its path. Charlie looked up at the ceiling fan. It was still there, but one of its blades was missing. There were double doors to the right with circular windows. Unlike the dining area, which was breached with sunlight and the sounds of the outside, the room behind double doors was still pitch black. John was more interested in this than Charlie, and he carefully peered into one of the windows, obviously tempted to nudge it open and see what was inside. Charlie led him to his curiosity, and walked farther into the dining room, which she only knew was as the dining room through memory. Now it was a vacant, lonely room, stretching long and narrow at least 50 feet, growing darker as it went. There was a slightly elevated stage at the end of the room, and Charlie realized as she looked around that the place had probably once been a dance hall, and the long desk by the entrance that her parents had used for a cash register had probably been a bar. She went over to it and saw that she was right. There were even grooves and scratches in the wood floor where bar stools had once dug their feet. She tried to picture it, a dark bar with a country western band playing on the stage, but she could not. When Charlie looked at the stage, she could still see two animatronic animals in shadow, moving in unnatural twists and turns. She could hear echoes of carnival music and distant laughter. She could still smell the cigarette smoke in the air. She hesitated before going further, as though the ghosts she remembered might linger on the stage. She tried to catch a glimpse of where John was. He finally had the door to the kitchen half open and was sticking his head inside. Charlie turned her attention back to the stage and walked toward it across the creaking floor. Even the smallest sound was deafening, accompanied by a faint whistles in the wind slipped through the cracks in the windows and walls. Strips of wallpaper had peeled down and hung flat against the wall, inert until a breeze lifted them up, and they wagged like thin fingers pointing at Charlie as she walked. Charlie stood at the base of the stage, studying the floor carefully for traces of what might have been there before. All that remained were holes where bolts had once been. The corners looked blackened, with shapes of coils and wires etched into dirt and wood. Everything is gone. Her head jerked toward the corner to her right. There was another door. Of course there is another door. This is why you are here. She stood still, looking at the door, but not ready to touch it. She was grasped with a strange and illogical fear, as though spiders and boogeymen might come rushing out. The door was ajar. Charlie looked back toward John again, hesitant to go on without him. As though he heard her calling to him, he leaned out to the kitchen with a wide-eyed expression. This is really creepy. He was obviously enjoying himself like a kid in a haunted house. Can you come with me? Charlie's plea came as a surprise to John, who seemed pleased but irritated at the same time, having been enjoying his own adventure on the other side of the building. 2 seconds, he promised, then disappeared again. She rolled her eyes, disappointed but not surprised that his childish curiosity would take priority. She rested the back of her hand against the aged wooden door and gently guided it open, bracing herself against whatever might be inside. Whatever she had been expecting, this wasn't it. It was a closet, the inside extending off to her about 8 or 9 feet into darkness. There were horizontal poles mounted along the walls where hangers had once been. Square shapes imprinted in the dust filled her mind with images of boxes, maybe speakers. As she stepped inside, she pushed the door open all the way, trying to let in as much light as possible. As she walked farther in, she let her hand drag along the wall. Although nothing was there now, she could feel heavy cloth, coats, and sweaters hanging. No, these were costumes. These were costumes. Costumes had hung here in the dark, hiding their color, but allowing themselves to be felt by every cheek and small hand that passed through. Rubber-padded palms and fingers swayed this way and that, reflections on false eyes passed overhead. Charlie reached the end and turned to look back. She crouched down, looking up at the empty space. It didn't feel empty. She could still feel the costumes. They were hanging all around her. There was someone else in the closet with her. Kneeling down at her own height, it was her friend, the little boy, my little brother. They were both playing hide-and-seek together as they always did. This time was different. The little boy looked up toward the door, suddenly as though they have been caught doing something they shouldn't be doing. Charlie looked up as well. There was a figure in the door. It looked like one of the costumes was standing on its own, but it was motionless, so still that Charlie wasn't sure what she was seeing. It was the rabbit, the yellowish-brown rabbit they loved, but it did not dance or sing, just stood there and stared at them unblinking. They began to squirm under its gaze, and the little boy screwed up his face to wail. Charlie pinched his arm, seized with an instinctual sense that they must not cry. The rabbit looked back and forth from one to the other with those all too human eyes, ponderous as though weighing and measuring them in some way that Charlie could not understand, like it was making a momentous decision. Charlie could see its eyes, its human eyes, and she was cold with terror. She felt the fear in her brother as well, felt it echoing between them, reverberating and growing because it was shared. They could not move, they could not scream, and finally the creature inside the patchwork ragged yellow rabbit suit reached forward for the boy. There was a moment, one single moment, where the children still clung together, gripping hands, but the rabbit snatched the boy to his breast, yanking them apart, and fled. From that moment, the entire memory shattered with piercing and unrelenting screams, not her brother's, but her own. People rushed to help. Her father picked her up and held her, but nothing could console her. She screamed and screamed louder and louder. Charlie snapped back from her dream, the sound still high and painful in her ears. She was crouched down in silence. John stood at the door, not daring to interrupt. She did not remember much of what happened next. Everything was dark. It was all a blur of images and facts she had pieced together later. Things she might remember, and others she might have imagined. She was never in the restaurant again. She knew her parents shuttered the doors immediately. Then they moved to the new house, and Charlie's mother left a little while after that. Charlie did not remember her saying goodbye, although she knew her mother must have. Her mother would not have left without a goodbye, but it was just lost in the mist of time and grief like so much else. And remembered the first time she stood in the doorway of her father's workshop, the first day they were alone in everything. It was the day he began to build her a mechanical toy, a little dog who tilted its head from side to side. She smiled and she saw it finished, and her father looked at her at the way he would look at her for the rest of her life, as though he loved her more than life itself, and as though his love made him unbearably sad. She knew even then that something vital inside him had broken, something could never be repaired. Sometimes he seemed to look right through her, as if he couldn't see her even when she was standing right in front of him. You could be right, Smile. Her father never again spoke her brother's name, and so Charlie leaned not to speak it, either, as though to speak it would send them back to the time and unravel them both. She woke in the mornings and looked for the little boy, having forgotten in her dreams that he was gone. When she turned to where he would be and saw only her stuffed toy, she would cry. But she would not say his name. She was afraid to even think about it, and she trained her mind to shrink from it until she truly forgot. But deep inside she knew it. Sammy! A rumbling sound rose, loud and low like a train passing, and Charlie startled. A train? She looked around her, eyes wide. She was disoriented, not sure if she was in the past or present. It's okay. I don't think it's anywhere near here. Might be just a truck. Big truck. John took Charlie's arm and pulled her to her feet. Did you remember something? He whispered. He was trying to catch her gaze, but she was focused elsewhere. A lot. Charlie put her hand to her mouth, still staring into the darkness as if she could see the scene. John's hand on her arm was an anchor. She clung to him so fast. This is real. This is now, she thought. And she turned to him, seized by a fierce gratitude that he was there with her. She buried her face in the chest, as if his body could shield her from what she had seen. She let herself cry. John hugged her tight, one hand on her head, cautiously stroking her hair. They stayed that way for long moments, and at last she calmed, her breathing deep and even again. John loosened his grip on her, and soon as she did, Charlie stepped back, suddenly aware of how close they had been. John's hands were still suspended in midair from where Charlie had been. After a moment of shock, he lowered one and used the other to scratch his head. So he hoped for an answer to fill the silence. A rabbit, Charlie said calmly, looking towards the way. A yellow rabbit. Her voice became graver as the image was still fresh in her mind. The one I saw the night Michael disappeared. The bear. I'm pretty sure he was yellow too. A yellow rabbit. The one I saw the night Michael disappeared. The bear. I'm pretty sure he was yellow too. I thought you said it was like the others, Charlie said. I thought it was. When everybody said Freddy was brown that night when we first met up, I just thought I was remembering it wrong. I mean, I really don't have a great memory for back then, you know. I didn't even remember what color my old house was. But then you said he was yellow too. Yeah, they were yellow, she nodded. It was the answer he was expecting. I think it's connected. The animals from here and the one I saw at Freddy's. And the one that took my brother, Charlie thought. She took a final look around the place. Oh. Let's go back, she said. I want to get out of here. Okay, John said. I am a YouTuber too from a gotcha club making reactions. Okay, cool. As they headed to the door, a small object caught Charlie's eye, and she snatched it up. It was a twisted piece of metal, and as John watched close by, she stretched it out and then let it snap back together with a loud crack like a whip. John jumped. What was that? He said, composing himself. I'm not sure, she said, but she slipped it into her pocket. Johnny was watching her like there was something she wanted to say. Something he wanted to say, I'm sorry. Let's go, Charlie said. They began to trek back to the car. Sammy, then years later, Michael, and the other kids, of course. It's connected, Charlie thought. Lightning might strike twice, but not murder. Can you drive again? She asked after a long period of silence. The only sounds so far had been those shoes crunching through the dry grass. Yeah, of course, he said. Wow. That's cool. I wish you will reach like this, like me. I sure do. I hope so too. John managed to get the car turned around in the constricted space, and Charlie settled against the window. Her eyes half closed already, she watched the trees fly by outside her window and felt herself beginning to doze. The metal object in her pocket was digging into her leg, keeping her awake, and she repositioned it, thinking dreamily of the first time she saw one of those things. She was sitting with Sammy in the restaurant before it opened for the day. They were under a window in a dusty beam of light playing some invented game she could no longer remember, and their father came over grinning. He had something to show them. He held up the piece of the twisted metal and showed them how to open it, and then let it snap back in hand. They both cried out in surprise, then started giggling and clapping their hands. Sure, you can do that, Smile. You can go ahead. Okay. Their father did it again. I could snap off your nose, he said. And again they laughed, but quickly his face turned serious. I mean it, he said. This is a spring lock. This is a spring lock, and I want you to know how it works because it's very dangerous. And I don't ever want you touching these. This is why we never put our hands in the animals' costumes. They're very easy to trigger these if you don't know what you're doing. You could get hurt. It's like touching the stove, Do we ever touch the stove? They shook their heads with a solemnity beyond their years. Good, because I want you both to grow up with all your noses, he cried, and he swept them up, one in each arm, swinging them around as they laughed. Suddenly, there was a loud snap. Charlie jolted out of sleep. What was that? What was what? John said. The car was off. Charlie looked around. They were back at the motel. Charlie took a moment to reorient herself. Oh, thank you, Rama. To reorient herself, then gave a reluctant smile. Thanks for driving. What were you dreaming about? John said. You looked happy. Charlie shook her head. I don't remember. Ooh, we're getting into the juicy bits now, folks. Alright, chapter 6. Last chapter for the stream. And then I'm going to take a break because I'm getting tired of reading. And by the looks of it, we're almost halfway through the book. I think halfway through chapter 6 might be the middle of the book. Oh, you don't have to do it too soon, Smile. Then take your time. Oh, and yeah, I'll try to see when I can stream some more Hololive Treasure Mountain. I'll try to do that soon. Maybe not today, but who knows. Chapter 6. The other car was gone from the lot, and when they went into the room, there was a note on Charlie's pillow written in Marla's big loopy handwriting. We're meeting for dinner at 6:30 and then going to you-know-where, she had written. See you too soon. Don't forget about the rest of us. XOXO, Marla. She had drawn a smiley face and a heart below her name. Charlie smiled to herself, folding the note and slipping it into her pocket without showing it to John. What does it say? He asked. We have to meet them at the diner in... Checked her watch. An hour. Hold on. I got something in my nail. At least I thought it did. John nodded. He was still standing in the doorway waiting for something. What? Charlie said. We need to go change, he said, gesturing at the rumpled clothing he was wearing. Can I take your car? He held up the keys and jangled them. Yeah, of course. Just come back for me, Charlie said with a grin. He smiled. Of course, he added with a wink. When the door closed behind him, Charlie let out a sigh. Alone at last. She was unaccustomed to so much company. She and Aunt Jen moved in their own orbits, meeting gladly from time to time throughout the day, but with the assumption that Charlie could take care of her own needs or would speak up if she could not. Charlie never spoke up. She could feed herself, get to school and back, and maintain her high grades and casual friendships. What could Aunt Jen do about nightmares? About questions she did not really want the answers to? What could Aunt Jen tell her that was not even more... Okay. If you do live. Well... Okay. what about questions she did not really want the answers to. What could Aunt Jen tell her that was not even more horrific than what she already knew? She was not used to the sustained presence of other people, and it was a little tiring. Smile, I do more than just live streams. I make videos too, just letting you know. She showered quickly and pulled on the new clothes, jeans, and a black t-shirt, then lay back on the bed, staring up at the ceiling. She had a vague sense that her mind should be racing with excitement or horror at their discoveries, going over and over the memories she had awakened, searching for something new. Instead, she just felt blank. She wanted to be alone, to push the memories to the back of her mind where they belonged. After what seemed like only a few short minutes, there was a knock on the door, and Charlie sat up, checking her watch. More time had passed than she realized. It was time to leave. She let John in. "I'll have to put on my shoes," she said. She looked up at him as she knotted the laces. He had changed, this time into jeans and a t-shirt, a contrast with the formal clothes she had gotten used to. His hair was still wet. There was something fresh and bright about him. She smiled a little. "What?" he said when he noticed. "Nothing," she said. "You still look dirty," she joked as she pushed it past him. They got in the car. This time she drove, and when they reached the diner, Charlie turned off the engine and hesitated, not moving to leave the car. "John," he said, "I don't want to tell anyone about Fredbear's." But he stopped himself. Yeah, he said. "I think we forgot this is your life and not just some adventure. It's fine. I can keep a secret." "It's all our lives," she said. "We were all there. We can tell them later. I just want to sort some of it out for myself right now." "You got it," he said. And he looked a little pleased. Charlie knew why. It was a secret between them. Something she entrusted only to him. What's this? That's the greatest one of it I finally found. A streamer. Okay. Thank you. When they went inside, everyone was already halfway through dinner. Charlie realized with a sharp pang that she had not eaten all day, and she found herself suddenly starving. The waitress spotted them as they sat down and came over immediately. They talked intermediately. Lamar, Jason, and Marla had gone to a movie, and Carlton and Jessica had played video games at his house. But their conversation was cursory, just filling the time as they ate. Charlie barely listened, as they had the feeling that even those who were talking were paying little attention to their own words. There was an agitated energy among the groups. They were all just waiting, their minds already focused on Freddy's. What about you two? What about you two? Jessica asked, looking at Charlie and John. "Yeah, what about you two?" Marla echoed with a twinkle in her eye. "We just went for a drive," John said quickly. "Got lost for a while." "I bet you did," Carlton muttered into his burger, grinning slyly even though his mouth was full. After dinner, the group hurried through the mall and toward the restaurant, hushed and cautious. As they passed through the atrium, their shoes made only soft sounds on the tiled floor, and no one spoke. Charlie had left the big flashlight in her car. They knew their way well enough by now, and the guard had almost seen... Wait, what? Left the big flashlight in her car? I'd still bring it if I were you. They knew their way well enough by now, and the guard had almost seen them the night before. There was no reason to risk drawing extra attention. They came to the end of the hall, and Lamar, at the front of the group, stopped short. Charlie bumped into Marla before she realized what was happening, and she murmured an apology and then froze. The night guard was blocking the alley behind Freddy's, his arms folded across his chest. He had no flashlight, and so And so he had been invisible, hidden in the darkness until they were almost upon him. I had a feeling you wouldn't leave it alone, he said with an odd, uneven smile. Marla whispered something unpleasant under her breath. I could have you arrested for trespassing, he said. Saw you here last night, but I couldn't see where you got to. I guess now I know, he added with a smirk. There was something almost immediately off-putting about the man. He was tall and slightly too thin for his uniform, which bagged at his shoulders and waist, as if he had once been a more robust man, but had lost his form somehow due to illness or tragedy. His name tag, reading Dave, hung askew on his chest. His skin was sallow, and his eyes were undercut by heavy lines, adding to the impression of long-standing ill health. What were you all doing back here anyway? He demanded. You kids partying? Drugs? I could have you arrested right now, you know. Charlie and John glanced at each other. We're sorry, Lamar said quickly. We'll go. We don't have any drugs. Says who? Says you? The guard wore an odd expression, and his words were harsh and fast. He seemed not to be responding to what they were saying. He looked angry, but his mouth kept quirking up at the corners, like he was trying not to smile. What do we do? Jessica whispered. Probably the most action he's ever had out here, Carlton said with a hint of disdain, and Charlie remembered suddenly that Carlton's father was a cop. She remembered him in his uniform, tilting down his long, dark sunglasses at them with a mock glare and then smiling, revealing the joke. The guard, however, looked like he meant it. We'll go, Lamar said. Sorry. Charlie looked at the man, considering him. The ill-fitting uniform, his peaky, almost exhausted-looking features. He could really kick them off the property or even have them arrested for trespassing. But still, she could not really fear him. His inadequacy alone threw him like a kind of negative charisma. He would always be shoved to the back of a crowd, always shouted down in argument, always picked last, forgotten, ignored in favor of those who were simply more vital, more vigorously attached to life. Charlie frowned at herself. It was an unusual train of thought for her. She did not usually assume she could read the lives of strangers through the lines on their face, but it gave her an idea. Why don't you come with us? Oh my... What? Why don't you come with us? She said. We just want to explore a little bit more, then we'll leave. You know your way around better. You know your way around better than us, any of us. She added, hoping that some of the flattery would stick. And then we'll never come back. Again, Carlton said. The guard did not immediately dismiss the idea, and the others quickly chimed in with their own assurances. The guard peered at them one by one, fixing his gaze on each in turn. When he looked at Charlie, he looked away, not wanting to meet his eyes, as if she would be giving something away. If she let him look too deeply, once he had inspected them to his satisfaction, he nodded. Sure. Can you see us in the live? Yes, I can see you in the chat. Yeah, I attached my chat to OBS somehow. Sure, he said, only because I've always wanted to take a walk in there myself. He jerked a thumb behind him, and catching the surprise that must have shown on their faces at it. I'm not an idiot. I've been working here for years. Walked this building inside and out every night. You think I don't know what's back there? Charlie felt herself flush. She had somehow assumed their discovery was unique. The guard looked down at his name tag, suddenly then pointing to it. Name's Dave, he said. I'm Jason, Jason said. And a little warily, the others recited their own names in turn. They stood there, looking at... looking at one another awkwardly for a moment, no one wanting to be the first to move. Then Jessica shrugged. "Come on," she said. She walked quickly to the scaffolding that hid the alley to Freddy's, and pulled back the plastic, revealing the break in the wall. They all filed through, squeezing past the piled boxes. Dave hung back politely and letting them all go first. He mentioned to Charlie to go ahead. I don't want you behind me," Charlie thought. She looked at Jessica, who wasn't moving either. "Please, go ahead," Charlie said with an edge in her voice, and Dave ducked his head shyly and went. Charlie followed him, and Jessica tucked the plastic carefully back where it was, concealing their passage even though there was no one left to catch them. As they made their way down the dank alley, Charlie touched her fingers to the brick wall, dragging her hand along it as if to guide her. The flashlight seemed a little dimmer now, though she knew it could only be in her imagination. They led the guard to the heavily wooden shelf that hid the entrance, and Lamar, John, and Jessica dragged it out of the way, revealing the door. Charlie expected their new companion to be impressed, but he just nodded, as if he had suspected this all along. One by one, they entered the hall to the restaurant, and again Charlie lagged behind from the group. She caught Carlton by the arm, and he passed her. "Carlton," she whispered, "have you ever seen this guy?" Carlton shook his head. "It's not that small a town. I don't know everybody." Charlie nodded absently, her eyes still on the newcomer as they made their way down the long hallway into Freddy's main dining room. She had invited the guard because it seemed like the only way to get back in, but now she was beginning to regret it. Letting a stranger into Freddy's was like letting him into her home, like giving something up. "What happened to the restaurant?" Lamar said, his tone carefully even, forcing a friendliness he could not have felt. "Why was it boarded up? Why is this mall abandoned anyway?" His voice sounded thin and narrow and a little muted. "You don't know?" Dave said. "This town needs money, jobs, revenue, things like that, and one thing we've got a lot of is space. So they decided to build a big mall, try to attract businesses, and maybe even tourists. They built up around where Freddy Fazbear's was, but when it came to it, no one would lease the restaurant, because of what happened. So someone had the bright idea of sealing the whole place up intact, someone who had a sentimental attachment to it, perhaps. I don't think they even tried to clear it out, but it wasn't enough. Something about that place spilled over into the rest of the building, maybe right down to the soil. No one wanted to bring their business here. Sometimes business owners, franchises from outside the town would come and look at the place, but they never signed the papers. Said it just didn't feel right. I think it's got an aura, a mystical energy maybe, if you believe in that sort of thing." Dave wiggled his fingers in the air as though casting a spell. "Yes, I'm wearing a vampire cape. I'm wearing it for Spooky Month." "I don't believe in that sort of thing," Lamar said shortly. But the guard did not seem to notice his tone. "To each his own," he said. "All I know is no one ever wanted their stores here, and they abandoned the construction before the building was even finished. And nobody comes up here except kids wanting to screw around, and me," he added with what sounded like pride. He must have felt passionate. Charlie thought the only one who ever came here for years and years, it must have felt like it belonged to him. This strange, half-finished building. To him, they must be the invaders. They came to the end of the hallway, and the space opened up before them. Jessica ran ahead to the control room beneath the stage, her flashlight bobbing merrily ahead of her. She disappeared for a moment, then hit the light switch, and all at once the room was warm and bright. Charlie stopped blinking in the sudden light. Dave brushed past her, and as he did something, caught her eye. There was a scar on his neck, curved and ugly, almost a perfect half moon. The tissue was knotted and white. The cut that made it must have been a deep one. Only a few feet away, Dave turned in a circle, taking in the restaurant, awed, and as he did, Charlie saw that the scar had a twin, the same half moon, in the same place on the other side of the neck. She shivered a little. The marks were too clean, too perfectly placed. They almost looked deliberate. I think Dave is sus. The group fanned out. Carlton, for some reason, headed toward the kitchen, and Jason wandered away toward the arcade again. Be careful, Marla called after him, but she was already following Lamar to the control room to join Jessica. You look cool wearing it. Thank you. Charlie hung back and John stayed with her. There was something different in the air. Charlie thought it felt thinner, like she had to breathe deeper to get enough oxygen. It's just a guy, she told herself. But that was the problem. They had brought an outsider in with them. And now the restaurant felt less secure, no longer hidden away. Freddy's had been breached. Freddy, Bonnie, and Chica had begun to jerk in their same stiff single movements. Charlie looked at Dave, but he did not appear surprised. He's been here before, she thought. Then, of course he's been here before. The whole town used to come here back then. Nice to meet you, Ramzan. John motioned her on, and reluctantly she went with him to the control room, Dave tagging along behind them like a stray. In the booth, Jessica was hunched over pressing buttons, and Lamar was studying the control board, trying to make sense of it. Dave peered intently over the shoulders, watching. He was nodding slightly to himself, wrapped up in some private calculation, when Jessica stepped back and stretched. He cleared his throat. He said, "Could I try?" He drew himself up a little, extending his arm graciously. Jessica and Lamar exchanged glasses, then shrugged. "Why not?" Jessica said. They shuffled around so that he could reach the board, and he started down at it for a long moment without moving. Then he touched a short series of buttons. A hum rose from the speakers, a long, low tone that did not waver. "Whoa," Jessica said, and pointed to the monitors. Charlie saw the movements on screen and backed out of the control room to look for herself. On stage, the animals were dancing. Crudely, awkwardly, without the grace or complexity, Charlie remembered, they were moving in sequences, not just one motion at a time. "How did you do that?" she snapped, not caring if it was rude. Dave raised his hands in the air. "Beginner's luck," he said. "I just pressed some buttons." "Right," Charlie said. She rubbed her temples. "Can someone please turn off the speakers?" Lamar darted forward and flipped a switch, and the sound died. Despite the silence, Charlie felt as if she could still hear it, whining away inside her head. She closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them, Jessica and Lamar had gone back to working the controls. But there was a caution to their movements, and they glanced at each other every few seconds as if seeking reassurance. Charlie looked at John. His arms were folded across the chest, and his eyes were trained on the back of Dave's head. In the arcade, Carlton pressed some random buttons on a game console, knowing nothing would happen, then turned around, finding himself the subject of an 11-year-old's resentful stare. "What?" he said. I'm not a baby, Jason said. "You don't have to watch me." "What, Jason? I'm not watching you. I'm just hanging out with you. I'm not Marla. Go stick your tongue in an electric socket for all I care." He waggled his eyebrows comically, and Jason laughed. "Okay, then, maybe I will," he said. He scanned the baseboards for a socket, briefly considering calling Carlton's bluff. But when he glanced back, Carla had already wandered off. Jason bit his lip and rocked on his heels, feeling foolish. After a moment, he went back to the drawings on the wall. There were too many drawings to peruse each one in turn, but Jason suspected that he would not need to, as they had the night before. The drawings would come to him. They wanted to be found. All Jason has to do was look. The drawings in the arcade gave up nothing. They were just children's grubby art, faded with age. He went back out into the dining room, still hugging the walls and scanning them, hunting for something that was more than crayon. "What are you up to, Jason?" Lamar was suddenly behind him. Jason turned around and studied him for a moment, considering. He liked Lamar, even if his friendliness could be traced easily to his interest in Marla. Lamar had bent down so his head was almost level with Jason's, and Jason leaned toward him and whispered, "The drawings are moving." Lamar drew back, and for a moment, a look of real alarm crossed his face, but it was fleeting. Jason bit his lip, waiting, and Lamar grinned, then reached out to pat him on the head. "Okay, Jason, we'll get you the help you need." "Oh, wow!" he said heartily, and Jason laughed and slapped Lamar's hand away. "Shut up, seriously, Jason," he said with a hint of sheepishness, and Lamar patted his head again and headed off. And soon as Lamar was a few feet away, Jason rolled his eyes. "What do you think I am, your pet?" He gave his hair a violent tussle, as if he could shake loose whatever Lamar had done to him. Then he went back to the wall, concentrating. He had made his way along the wall and was turning to the corner when it happened. A flicker just out of the corner of his eye, almost a shimmering. He stopped. Which one was it? He scanned the drawings again, going up and down the wall around the place. He thought he had seen movement, but there was nothing. He started over, stopping to look at each crayon scribble, and then it happened again. He seized on it this time, his eyes finding the drawing just as the shimmer of movement stopped. And just as he did, he saw another, so brief that he wouldn't have ignored it. Just a trick of the light, had he not been watching for it. It was above the first, maybe 2 feet to the left. His eyes darted back and forth, trying to see both at once. Suddenly, there was a third movement in a drawing between the two. This one more noticeable. This time, he almost saw the drawing shift before it was still again. Sitting back on his heels, Jason looked at the 3 drawings, each in turn. The crayon was black, and they all looked like they had been drawn by the same kid, all with 2 figures in the foreground, a child and a rabbit. Jason glanced around the room. His sister and the others still seemed to be engaged by the stage. Lamar had gone back to join them. Jason pulled the drawing he had found the night before from his pocket. He smoothed it out, pressuring it to the surface of the floor. Then slowly he peeled its linty tape out flat and stuck the paper to the wall just at his eye level. He stared at the wall, waiting. Nothing happened. Jason frowned. He had been so certain that these would tell him something, but they were just drawings. The child and the bunny stood in the middle of the paper, in one close together, in another far apart. But there was nothing there that could be called a story. Oh well, he started to look over at the others again. The highest one began to move. This time he saw the shift. The crayon lines twisted and slid on the page, moving of their own accord, too fast to follow. When the first stopped moving, another started. They continued one after the other until the one he had just put back was finished. Jason watched, his eyes wide, his heart pounding, but by the time he realized what was happening, it was over. The figures were fixed in place, and now they did tell a story. In the first, a child was sitting alone. The second, Bonnie appeared behind the child. In the next, Bonnie had snatched the child, lifting it off the ground. And in the last, the child was screaming. His eyes wide as his heart racing. Jason stepped back. He was transfixed. His whole body suddenly felt laden, too heavy to run. A sound arose like wind rustling the pages on the wall. Though they hung motionless before him, the sound rushed and grew louder and louder until the wind gave way to screaming. Jason clapped his hands over his ears as the pages began to drop from walls, landing with loud crashes as if they were made of something far heavier than paper. As he watched, the falling pages turned a dark red, soaking through with color as if they touched the floor. Jason turned to run, but his path was blocked as pages tumbled from the ceiling in a torrent. One landed on his shoulder, another on his back, and then another as they clung to him, wrapping around him as if they would suffocate him. Jason felt his legs buckle under the weight, dropping at last to one knee. As he braced himself under the storm of paper, the room began to shake violently. Jason gritted his teeth, trapped, and suddenly it was over. The red-soaked papers were gone. There was nothing on his back, and Marla had him by the shoulder and was staring at him wide-eyed. "Jason, what on earth is wrong with you?" Jason scrambled to his feet, brushing himself off as if he were covered with the invisible insects. "The pictures were falling on me," he said urgently, still panicked, but as he looked back at the wall, he realized the room was silent and still. A single picture had fallen from its place. Marla looked down at it, then back to her brother and shook her head. She leaned close to hiss into his ear. "You embarrass me." She let loose her grip after a moment. Her face almost blanked and walked away. "Of course I'm going to end the stream after I'm done finishing this chapter. Like I said, I'm reading chapters 4 through 6, and I'm almost done with 6, and it's getting good." She let loose her grip after a moment, her face almost blank, and walked away. Jason stumbled as he got to his feet, but followed as quickly as he could, keeping his eyes trained on the walls as they went. In the control room, Dave had his hands on the buttons, his fingers wandering lightly over them without pressing anything. The movement looked careless, instinctual, like a habit. Charlie leaned close to John. "He's been here before," she whispered. "Look at the way he touches the controls. Maybe he's just good with computers," John offered, not sounding convinced. "Can you make them dance again?" Jessica asked. Dave barely seemed to acknowledge the question. His mouth hung slightly open as he seemed to be staring at something none of them could see. In the bright lights, they could all see that his uniform was grubby and torn in places, his face poorly shaven and his eyes a little unfocused. He looked less like a guard than a vagrant, and he looked at them all as if he had wandered in ages ago, and they were the newcomers. It took him a moment to register the question. "Sure, let's see what we can do," he said. He smiled at her, his mouth askew, his eyes were a little too intent on her, holding her just a little too long. Jessica swallowed, seized with an instinctive revulsion, but she smiled back politely. "I'm not going to make it to the end. What am I, crazy? Or, at least not yet." "All right," Dave said. "I've been here for a few times before. I think I can work some magic." Charlie and John exchanged glances. "You've been here before?" John said in a careful, even tone, but Dave ignored him or did not hear. There was a keypad to the far left of the control board that no one had touched yet, as it did not appear to be connected to anything. Now Dave reached for it and began to press the buttons quickly, as if he had done it 100 times before. He gave Jessica a conspiratorial glance. "For special occasions, you can request a dance," he smiled at her again, with that crooked intensity. "Great," Jessica said, breathing a sigh of relief. Anything to get out of such forced proximity to this man. She looked at Lamar. Am I going to go I'm going to go look. Will you take over? Yeah, sure, he said, scooting forward to the field of vacancy as Jessica and Dave made their way out to the show area. On stage, the lights were flashing in patterns, accompanying the music that no longer played, and Bonnie's mouth was moving as though in song. His eyelids closed for long blinks, then opened again with loud clicks, his glass eyes moving from side to side. One large blue hand rose and fell, strumming exaggerately on the red guitar whose strings had long since gone missing. Lamar, how much of this are you doing? Cawthon said, suitably impressed. Not much, Lamar called back. Most of it seems programmed. Bonnie turned to them, and Jessica startled as he seemed to look right at her. He turned away as quickly to face the rows of empty seats, lifting his head to sing. It's strange seeing them like this, Jessica said, taking a step back to get a better view. Bonnie's foot tapped along in rhythm, and his mouth opened and closed with song. There was no voice, there was no music. There was only a strange humming from the speakers and an orchestra of mechanical snaps and squeaks. Bonnie sped up, strumming and tapping faster. His eyes suddenly seemed out of sync. Looking left while his head went right, he rolled back into his head, then rolling back into his head. Dave approached the stage with deliberate steps. Nervous little fella, aren't you? He smiled, seemingly unbothered as the rabbit moved faster and faster. Hey Lamar, can you take it down a notch? Jessica said. Bonnie's arms began convulsing violently, his mouth open but stammering, his eyes throwing their gaze in seemingly random directions. Lamar, something's wrong, Jessica cried. Bonnie's foot jerked upward with a sound like a gunshot, yanking free the bolt that anchored him to the stage. Lamar! Cawthon climbed onto the stage and hurried to Bonnie, trying to search the rabbit for an off button as he ducked its erratic swings. Cawthon, get down, you idiot! Jessica ran to the stage. Bonnie was moving too fast, out of control, as if his program had hit a glitch. He was no longer following the dance sequence they all remembered so well. He began to convulse and thrash. Okay. Cawthon scrambled back, trying to get away, but Bonnie's arm broke away from the guitar, swinging out at hitting Cawthon across the chest, knocking him off the stage. He landed on his back and stayed down, gasping for breath. Lamar! Jessica shouted. Lamar, turn it off! I don't know how, he yelled back. Jessica knelt down beside Cawthon, looking helplessly at him. He tapped his shoulder insistently. Cawthon, are you okay? Cawthon, look at me. Cawthon gave a small laugh that sounded more like a cough, then grabbed her hand and pulled himself up to sit. It's okay, he said. Just got the wind knocked out of me. Jessica still looked worried. I just need a minute, he assured her, the words still coming out in little wheezes. In the control room, Lamar pressed button after button frantically, but on the screen he could still see Bonnie moving wildly and at random, not responding to anything he did. Charlie rushed in, pushing him out of the way, but it took her only seconds to see that the buttons were powerless. She locked eyes with Lamar's for a second. We aren't in control, she thought. As one, they rushed from the control room to help the others. Looks like Bonnie's gone rogue on his own. The controls are doing nothing. Jessica screamed a short, high-pitched sound, and Marla and John ran to her. Charlie and Lamar arriving seconds later. All the animals were moving now in that same fitful way, cycling through their program movements at random with a desperate, panicked air. The lights began to pulse, flickering rapidly on and off. The sage lights did the same, the colors appearing and disappearing, so that the whole space was washed first in bright gold, then a sticky green, then a bruised and vicious purple. Then like gold, green, and purple? That's a mysteriously familiar combination. They blinked like strobes, and the effect was nauseating. The speakers blared brief bursts of static cutting in and out like the lights, and beneath the static was the same sound they have heard the night before. The growling of a voice too low to be human, too indistinct to be speaking of words. The group came together cautiously, not quite trusting their own senses. The lights throbbed savagely, as Charlie walked toward her friends, he could not be sure how far away they were or what was in front of her. They huddled in the middle of the floor, staring at the animals as they rattled and rocked as if with their own agenda. Carlton got to his feet. Jessica watched him with concern, but he waved her off. "I told you I'm fine," he said, shouting to be heard over the intermittent noise. Charlie stood fixed in place, unable to take her eyes off the animals. "They're trying to get away," she thought. It was a child's thought, and she tried to dismiss it, but it clung as she watched them, scarcely noticing the fitful flickering of the lights and sounds. The animatronic creatures didn't look like they were glitching. Their movements seemed not mechanical, but hysterical. Like there was something they needed desperately to do, but horribly could not. "Where's Dave?" John said suddenly. Charlie met his eyes with a rising dread. "Oh no." They all looked around, but the guard was nowhere in sight. "We have to find him," Charlie said. "He probably left already. Who cares?" Marla said, her voice high and frightened. "I'm not worried about him," she said grimly. She turned to John. Come on, she said, setting off toward the hallway to the right of the stage. He glanced at the rest of the group over his shoulder, then followed Charlie at a brisk pace. "We should find the other control room and see what we can do to stop all this from here," Jessica said crisply, taking charge. "You and Jason go look for Dave," she told Marla. I'll go with them," Lamar said quickly. "Control room?" Carlton said, looking at Jessica. "Control room," she confirmed. They all set off, moving slowly. The strobing lights distorted the space in front of them, seeming to throw up obstacles that were not there, obscuring the ones that were. The effect was disorienting, a constantly shifting maze of light and noise. "Ow!" Marla shouted, and everyone stopped short. "Are you okay?" Carlton yelled. "Yeah, I just bumped into the stupid merry-go-round," she called back. The speakers were momentarily noiseless, but they shouted across the small distance as if there were a canyon between them. I don't like eating pickles. In another hallway, Dave was moving toward a goal. Without the others there to watch, he moved fast, scuttling almost sideways and darting his eyes back over his hunched shoulders from time to time to see he was not followed. There was a large key ring at the belt of his uniform, but only a few keys hung from it. He selected one, opened a door, and let himself into the restaurant's office. He closed the door quickly behind him, cushioning it against noise, even though the group would never hear it this far away or note it between their own shouts and the blaring of the speakers. He turned on the overhead light, and it was steadily illuminating the room without a flicker. On the far wall, there was a tall closet flat against the wall, and he used another key on his ring to open it up. Dave stood still in the open door for a long moment, breathing deeply as he did. His back straightened and his hollow chest seemed to expand, drawing an uncharacteristic confidence from what he saw. An odd, thin smile on his lips. Dave reached out with his fingertips, savoring the moment, and brushed yellow fur. "I knew it! Dave is sus!" Jessica and Carlton hurried away down the hall toward the second control room. But Marla and the two boys moved more slowly, sticking their heads into the party rooms, then the arcade. The rooms appeared empty, but the constantly changing light, Jason thought as they moved on, it would be easy to miss just about anything. Having checked the area, Marla and Lamar headed back into the main room. Where are Jessica and Carlton? Lamar shouted over. Another burst of garbled sound. Jason stopped and looked back in a fleeting instant and saw it. A rabbit, outlined in the hall for a split second as the lights flashed on him, then vanished and appearing again in place in the party room they had just left. Marla? Jason shouted. Marla! His voice was shrill, agitated. She whirled around. What? Are you okay? I saw Bonnie. He was there. What? Marla's eyes went automatically to the stage. Bonnie was there, moving back and forth in the same odd spastic movements. Wait. Jason, look, he's there. He can't move off the stage. Jason looked. Bonnie was there. I saw him, he thought, looking back down in the hallway, but it was empty. Jessica came running up, out of breath. Is everyone okay? I heard screaming. We're fine, Lamar said. Jason thought he saw something. Well, the books did say Dave was caressing his fingers around yellow fur from something, not from Chica, but from a costume, I am assuming. Anyway, where's Carlton? Marla said. She rubbed her temples. This light is giving me such a headache. He's still fighting with the controls, Jessica said. We should find Charlie and John. I think we need to get out of here. I think they went that way, Lamar said, pointing to the hall at the far end of the room, just past the stage. Come on, Jessica said. Jason followed as the group crossed the main dining room again, maneuvering cautiously around the tables and chairs. He looked back as they reached the hall. Suddenly, Bonnie appeared again, darting out from the arcade and ducking into the hall that led to Pirate's Cove. Jason watched his sister and the others file through the doorway, then slipped away before they could see him go. He ran across the room, intent on following the rabbit, then slowed his pace when he reached the dark hallway. The lights in the little hall were completely out, and though he could see nothing, it was a minor reflect from the pulsing strobes. Jason hugged the wall as he moved, trying to scan ahead of him for signs of movement, but it was too dark. His eyes had not adjusted after what seemed like ages. He came out of the hall and into Pirate's Cove. From a distance, he could hear his sister's voice calling his name. Guess they noticed I'm gone, he thought wearily. He ignored it. Crossing the room, he peered down the other hallway, the one that led to the more party rooms, but it was so dark that he could scarcely see more than a few feet ahead. Turning back, he approached the little sign, the little stage, the out of order sign still strung across it, as if anything in this place is in order. Suddenly, the curtain moved, and Jason froze. The curtain began pulling back. Jason couldn't bring himself to run. All went dark, and the lights came on suddenly to reveal Carlton standing in front of him, having emerged from the curtain behind. What are you doing back here by yourself? Come on, let's go. Carlton greeted him with a warm smile. Awash with relief, Jason took a step forward, opening his mouth to speak, and stiffened, still struck with fear. Bonnie suddenly broke through the darkness, appearing beneath the stage, lights before them. But it was not Bonnie. This rabbit's yellow fur was almost blinding in the light. He rushed at them, and before Jason could cry out, the giant rabbit had a hold of Carlton from behind, smothering his face with a giant matted paw and wrapping his other great arm around Carlton's chest. Gripping tightly, Carlton struggled. struggled silently, hitting and kicking, but the creature barely seemed to notice. He screamed into the rabbit's paw, but the sound was swallowed whole. As he fought, the rabbit slunk back the way he came, dragging Carlton with him like a prize from the hunt. Jason watched them go agape. His heart raced and his breath was shallow. The stifling air around him made him lightheaded. A noise came from behind him. The grinding screech of rusted metal beginning to move, and he leaped forward and turned around, moving just in time to avoid a hook. As it plunged swiftly downward. Foxy's eyes flashed in synchrony with the lights above, and for a dizzy moment, it seemed to Jason that those eyes were the controlling force behind it all. That if Foxy closed his eyes, every light might go out. The animal did not move like the others. It slowly, purposefully rose between the gap in the curtains. Its gleaming eyes reached with a staggering height. Jason! It was Charlie's voice. He knew, but he kept staring back and forth, first at Foxy, then at the place where Carlton had been stolen away. Jason, she called again. And then she and Jason were beside him, touching him, shaking him out. She and John were beside him, touching him and shaking him out of his ghastly reverie. John grabbed his hand and pulled him into a run. In the main room, the others were already halfway down the hallway to the outside door, all but Marla, who was waiting anxiously at the entrance, her face flooding with relief when she saw Jason. Marla, Bonnie, he took Carlton. Carlton, Jason yelled, but she put a hand on his back and pushed him through into the hall. Go, Jason, but I saw Bonnie take Carlton, he cried, but he ran, afraid to stop. They ran down the hall to the outside, all bouncing with a frightened impatience as they filed through the alley one by one. There was no way to go faster. When they were all through, Charlie looked down the hallway for a long moment, but there was no one coming. She shoved in the door closed and stepped out of the way as Lamar and John wrestled the shelf back into place, blocking it off. No one saw Dave, Charlie said. It was not a question. They all shook their heads. He must have taken off when the lights started going haywire, Lamar offered, but he did not sound convinced. Carlton! cried out again. Carlton is still in there. Bonnie took him. They all glanced around. Carlton was not with them. Oh no, Jessica said. He's still inside. Bonnie took him, Jason said, choking out the words one by one. His voice was shaking. I saw it. Bonnie was there. He was in Pirate's Cove, and he grabbed Carlton and carried him away. I couldn't stop him. He scrubbed a sleeve across his eyes, wiping tears. Yeah, you might be right, Smile. You might be right. Oh, sweetheart. Marley hugged him, and he clung to her, hiding his face in her shirt. No, it was a trick of the light. Bonnie couldn't do that. He's just a robot. He was on stage when he left. Jason closed his eyes. He had only glanced for a second at the main stage as they were leaving, but it was true. Bonnie had been there, moving in strange, clumsy twists and bends stuck in place. He pulled away from his sister's arms. I saw it, he insisted more weakly. Bonnie took him. The others exchanged glances overhead. Charlie looked at Marla, who shrugged. We have to go back in, Charlie said. We have to get him. Jessica was nodding, but John cleared his throat. I think we need help, he said. It's not safe in there. Let's get Carlton's dad, Marla said. I'm not taking Jason back in there. Charlie wanted to protest, but she bit her tongue. They were right. Of course they were right. Whatever had just happened was beyond them. They needed help. Well, oh my. Well, oh my goodness. Let me see. How many pages do the next 3 chapters contain? 8. Chapter 9. I guess I can... Yeah. Yeah, but his... Yeah, I think you're right, Smile, but I think his name is Dave in this book. Ah, this is getting juicy. This is getting pretty juicy, but I'm getting tired of reading. So, in the next stream, I'm gonna read the next 3 chapters, but this is getting good. I think I know what's gonna happen next, but I'll have to keep reading to reassure myself. But I'm gonna read the next 3 chapters with you guys instead of to myself. Wow. The plot thickens. So, yeah. I guess the past is catching up to them. Literally. So, it looks like we're in for a doozy. The next 3 chapters are going to be a blast. Alright? Yeah. So, I'm going to read the next 3 chapters soon. But right now, I need to take a break. My voice is getting tired. So, yeah. Did what? I read chapters 4 through 6 like I promised. I'm gonna read some... Okay. I gotta go. See ya. Wait, go live? Wait, I'm already...